All right. Well, I'm here to talk about the media after October 7th. It's a very broad topic. I have with me a whole lot of points I want to make, and we'll see what we can get to. But I guess I'd start with talking about immediately on October 7th itself and moving forward. There's the traditional media and then there's social media. And I think anyone who was on a computer on October 7th probably saw a lot of the crazy violence and horrifying videos that were going around that day. And I think some of the really horrifying things that Hamas was just broadcasting live and wanted the world to see shaped the early media coverage of the war. There was a sense of, I think, initial shock that played out in the international media, in the English speaking, especially international media, that you could see, the violence, clips of the terrible videos, photos of women being taken to Gaza, on the backs of motorcycles and things like that, made the front pages of newspapers, tabloids mostly, unfortunately, but it was things, Daily Mail, New York Post, things like that. But those are important because those have very wide readerships. And so the initial media story was really a story about Hamas coming into Israel and massacring Israelis. And I think that held for days, really, because the extent of the horrors became clearer as the days went on, as Israeli authorities were able to go in and to also allow journalists to go in to see what happened. But as, once Israel began to strike at Gaza, within a couple of days of the initial attack, you started having this battle of narratives, right? On the one hand, there's the Israeli narrative, and it's true, which is to say Hamas attacked first, and they attacked horrifically and did unspeakable things to Israelis. And I don't think I need to get into the details now, but we know that, and that was what started this war, right? We know there was a ceasefire on October 6th, right? Hamas broke it on October 7th, but then with the IDF and the Air Force strikes in Gaza and the casualty numbers starting to go up, that part of the narrative started to take more and more dominance, and I think you see constantly in the media. I'll focus on American media because that's the audience. You see it on TV, you see it in print articles, that it's sort of which narrative is going to come first, which narrative is going to take precedence in their news coverage. I think on TV overall, from what I have seen and what I've sort of been analyzing, there has mostly been more of a positive sort of balance. There are certain pitfalls, there are certain sort of easy mistakes that TV makes. I could say in my personal experience, and I know that other people who go on TV to talk about Israel will have this experience too, where we'll be talking about Israel, about casualties in Israel, about the Israeli hostages, about the things happening in this country, and there'll be B-roll, which is the sort of silent video of the news that's playing, say, next to me, right, next to my head on the TV, and it'll be of Gaza, right? So that's a mistake that's often made on TV, but I have found, and in this case, I'm not just talking about my personal experience talking on TV, I'm talking from what I've seen and what I've sort of studied, many, many clips of many different shows and things like that, that much of cable news and regular news, broadcast news in the US has painted more of a balanced picture, I think, whereas print has done sort of less of that, and there's a lot more focus on the casualties. Even when they're writing stories about inside Israel, about Israeli victims, they always make sure to put in those casualty numbers, which we don't even know. Nobody has a really good sense of what the Gaza casualties are. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but the difference between the Gazan casualty numbers and the Israeli casualty numbers is that Israel kept having to update the casualty numbers as they found more remains. As they found, they realized certain remains are of people who are actually Gazans and not Israelis, and the numbers kept changing, and it took like a month to get like a really solid number. Whereas the Gazan Health Ministry somehow manages to have numbers of people immediately within hours. So that just tells you the quality and the accuracy of the numbers coming from each side, at least at this point. But this is, this has been the case for a long time, and the media quotes it unquestioningly, which is definitely a problem. But in going back to what I was saying, I found that the major print newspapers in the US, where you're talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, in many cases also the Wall Street Journal, despite its editorial page being very, very pro-Israel, the news pages have certain biases that they're having trouble releasing or overcoming, even as, in the initial days, they saw what happened here and they reported on what happened here. They have not been able to let go. Now, we saw that there are certain employees of news outlets, of TV and print. And when I say print, I mean also, online news. I mean things that are written as opposed to things you're watching on TV. They have their employees, American employees and Palestinian employees alike, have displayed their extreme biases against Israel on their social media accounts. And I think the example that has caused, I think, the biggest uproar are these stringers working out of Gaza. So the sort of structure, the way this works is that these people are people who live in Gaza. They're often freelancers, but they're the freelancers that these places use when they need someone in Gaza to take pictures, to help get them access to people in power in Gaza. Sometimes they'll help them with translating. And in this case, there were a handful of photographers who were taking photos as the attack was happening on October 7th. And it was very clear from the photos that they were right there in the middle of the action, that they were, feet away, maybe in some cases inches away from the Hamas terrorists doing terrible things to Israelis. They were right there standing next to these little golf carts that like elderly people would ride around the kibbutzes, right? That terrorists were taking an old woman away on one of these golf carts, and you have a photographer standing right there next to it watching the kidnapping happen, right? So this was happening with stringers for the New York Times, for the Associated Press, for Reuters, for CNN. And this was something that Honest Reporting had uncovered. Honest Reporting is an organization that does media criticism, and points out when the media is biased against Israel. There's a very good reason to believe, although not like smoking gun level evidence, that these people were in some way warned in advance. Now, it's possible that Hamas said, look, there's just going to be news, come meet us at this place in the morning, and didn't tell them exactly what was going to happen. But, it looks very bad for these news outlets that they have photographers who were there as it was happening first thing in the morning. And on the other hand, this is the way news works everywhere in the world, in the sense that, and I'm not making excuses for them, but in the sense that if you want access to bad people, if you want reporters to be able to talk to the heads of Hamas or the heads of the Taliban or the heads of any ISIS, and quote them in articles, then the person who's going to make that connection for you is probably not going to be a very good guy either. And so there's like real, I think, difficult and ethical questions and the news media has to think about itself and how they use these people and these sort of this system to gain access and to get information. And I think that this really laid that bare. Unfortunately, most of the news outlets just made excuses. I believe CNN let the stringer go. One of the most egregious examples was someone who it was soon found that there were pictures of him hugging Yahya Sinwar, who's the head of Hamas in Gaza. And also he had filmed a video while he was sitting on a motorcycle and a grenade was being thrown from the motorcycle. Some people thought he was throwing the grenade. When I watched the video, it looked like there were like 3 men on the motorcycle, like 2 men in front of him, and it was one of the other men. But either way, not a good look. Not someone that the CNN and New York Times and all these places should be employing. Another person who the New York Times employed, was taking pictures in Gaza, had posted on Facebook about how much he loves Hitler, and the CNN and the New York Times let him go. But then they hired him again when the war started because he's the person who was giving them access to Hamas. I don't see that these news outlets are really rethinking their system. Certainly in the statements they made, they didn't say they were. And it's a real problem in the way that news is covered in these bad places. I'm not entirely sure what the solution is, because we do still want that access and that information. On the other side, I was talking about sort of more positive coverage that I've seen on some of the cable news programs in the US. And I think a lot of it has to do with individuals. I mean, some of the bad coverage also has to do with certain individuals and their views of things. But there are certain people who have been really understanding of the Israeli story and really bringing it to light, whether it's been Jake Tapper, Chris Cuomo on News Nation has also, he spent quite a long time in Israel covering the story. Trey Yingst, who's a reporter, not like a host the way the other people I mentioned are, not an anchor. They've been really doing a good job bringing the Israeli story. And I want to talk about sort of the other side of the media story, which is the Israeli public relations. Everyone likes to complain that Israel has terrible public relations, and I am definitely one of the people who likes to complain about it. But I have noticed a marked improvement as someone who's written a sort of analysis on this topic over, unfortunately, way too many operations in Gaza over the years. It seems that the current IDF spokesman especially has learned some lessons. Often the international media section sort of the IDF spokesman's office is treated as the like unwanted stepchild of the IDF. They don't care about the international media. They care about sort of the military reporters who are based in Israel, and they're not thinking about the international media. Now we have an IDF spokesman for the first time in something like 20 years. I mean, I was not an adult working in the news business when this happened, but I was told that in the second, and have read that in the second Intifada, there was also an IDF spokesman who spoke English. But in all the years that I have been covering the news in Israel, there has not been. It's always been someone sort of secondary to him. So now we have Danielle Hagari, who has been giving briefings in English, who has been doing videos in English, and has brought international journalists into Gaza, embedded them with the troops. And that has improved, I think, the quality of the reporting in some places. You have some places where sometimes you can't win, the BBC, for example, they wrote a story, they were embedded in Gaza, they were brought to one of the hospitals that was being used as a Hamas command center. And then they wrote a story saying that the IDF rearranged the weapons that they found, which to me is, I mean, the IDF denied that they rearranged it. So, I can't speak to whether they did or not, but if they had, do they not think that this was a dangerous place, that there could have been, grenades around or explosives, and that the IDF maybe should have gone in there and maybe poked around a little bit to make sure that the journalists weren't going to get killed when they get there? So who cares if the guns were a little bit in a neat row as opposed to in a messy pile? But it's like there's some people who are looking for the bad side of every story. And as a journalist, you definitely should always you should always be critical, right? You should always look at things with a critical eye, but certain times, I mean, the people are being absurd. That's how I felt about the BBC, and CNN actually wrote stories like that, and I felt like they were pretty absurd. But overall, I think that this IDF spokesperson has a greater understanding of the importance of international media in telling Israel's story, and has been more accommodating to international media. I think that's been important, and I think it's had a positive effect, especially when it came to these stories of the tunnels under the hospitals. In the weeks after that, we had the hostage exchanges over the course of a week. Well, sorry, the hostage exchange is the wrong term, because only one side is hostages, the other side are criminals and terrorists. But the hostage releases we had over a course of a week, so that was less of an IDF story. And now, of course, the IDF is back in Gaza. So, and I don't think that there have been any journalists embedding this week. I think, the IDF is still sort of getting its bearings and getting quite far into southern Gaza, but it hasn't been bringing journalists with them. In any case, there's the other side of Israel's official media strategy, and that's the government side, which honestly has been a little bit of a mess. The civilian side. That being said, there have been certain standout figures. I'm sure many of you have seen the videos of him. Elon Levy, who is someone who was being underutilized as a government employee and actually left in the summer. He was President Herzog's English language spokesman. And when the war started, he came back as a volunteer. And he was just volunteering through the prime minister's office and doing this news thing. Now he's officially an employee of the government again. They sort of lucked out, and he's been doing daily briefings, and he's been showing up on TV. I don't think that, other than Elon being a very talented speaker, that the government is doing all that it can to be promoting Israel's story, to be quite honest. There are certain embassies that are doing sort of better jobs independently, but the sort of pitfalls of not paying enough attention to the international media, not having like messages that are catered to the international media. And I'm not saying this isn't about what's true or what's not true, right? It's about knowing which stories are sort of interesting and could be successful in the international media, and knowing that they're not the same as the Israeli media. And I think that there's a bit of a problem with that, because I get, as someone who's based in Israel and speaks Hebrew, I make sure that I'm on all of the mailing lists. So I get the messages in Hebrew and in English, and I see that it's just translated, and sometimes not even translated well, right? So they're not like sort of catering their messages to the international media, which is the kind of thing that you have to do when you want to have successful messaging. I want to go back to what I was talking about, the journalists themselves. Sort of the next thing on my list, I talked about the journalists who are in Gaza. We also have the journalists who are in the US. Now, I said, you know, the government messaging is not as good as it could be, but of course the journalists themselves have to be receptive to these messages, right? You have to be able to report a story well, you have to be open to hearing the messages of both sides and judging them as they are. And you know, there are a number of journalists in the News Guild, which is sort of big journalists union. They signed letters wanting to be allowed to participate in protests and sign petitions and things like that, calling for a ceasefire or, you know, against Israel and things like that. And I think that that's deeply problematic if we're talking about reporters as opposed to sort of opinion journalists, just because it gets rid of it just completely undermines their credibility as someone who's able to tell a story of what is happening in a truthful and in a way that is, of course, as objective as possible. Now, it tells you about the situation about a lot of the journalists, these print journalists, and where they're coming from when they're writing. Everybody has their own sort of biases and their own background that they're coming from when they approach things. But what a good journalist has to do is trying to tell a story well is to try to neutralize that, right? And try to at least look in the eyes of the other person. Now, I can tell you, I mean, it's very difficult. It's very difficult for me to look through the eyes of a Palestinian. Frankly, most of the stories I write, you don't have to look through the eyes of a Palestinian, because I'm talking about sort of like Israeli politics or Israeli Israel's international relations. And I don't have to think about like, what does the Hamas person on the other side think? I have to think about what does the Biden administration think versus the Netanyahu administration, which like I can at least wrap my head around, right? But if you're a journalist and you're writing a story that's, you know, I don't know, about the casualties in Gaza, right? You have to think about what the Hamas person thinks, and you also have to think about why the IDF is striking them, and you have to give both sides, I think, at least some kind of a fair chance, right? And I sometimes you see it happening, sometimes you don't. I think there's a couple of stories that has been very interesting to see, the sort of news media arc. About almost a month ago already, there started to be sort of more and more evidence of sexual violence against Israeli women, some men also, but mostly women. There were some videos that came out on the first day already that gave very, very strong indications. I don't want to get into the details here, but I could say that I had started working on a story almost a little over 3 weeks ago on this topic, starting to gather evidence and write about it. And the police held a briefing for our international media, I guess because they were starting to hear interest in this, and they played testimony about women who had come to the police and given testimony on this topic, and they had like blurred the women's faces. They didn't give us names and things like that out of, you know, respect for their privacy. After that point, there started to be more and more stories in the Israeli media on this topic. Times of Israel, Haaretz, Jewish Insider, where I write, is American media, but I'm Israeli. I'm based in Israel, and I wrote about it as well. Interestingly, it took much longer for foreign media, for American media to write about it. Okay, you take a few more days, you want to try find something original that hadn't been reported before. I can understand all of that, because different outlets have different standards. When you're the New York Times, when you're the Washington Post, you're not going to want to write a story that somebody else wrote before. You want to find someone new. Fine. The thing that I found crazy is that the BBC published its story on this topic 2 days ago. And I looked on the calendar, I took out my calendar and I looked, because I was like, what? And it was 3 weeks to the day after that we had that briefing for international media it was at the Police Academy, Israel's National Police Academy. And yet most of the story, I would say 60-70% of the story, was based on that briefing alone, 3 weeks before. There was almost nothing in there that was newer than that. And if it was only maybe a few days newer than that. And it included a quote from the police cyber crimes department. Even though it's not a cyber crime, they have been collecting all of the videos that Hamas put up, right? And so the head of the cyber crimes unit had said it was too early to say how many incidents of sexual violence there were. And they put that quote in the article. It was too early to say, but they put that quote in the article 3 weeks after he said it. And I thought to myself, did they think to pick up the phone and to ask him? Is maybe it's not too early to say anymore 3 weeks later. Maybe he has like a better estimate, and they didn't do that work. And I said to myself, I wonder if they didn't want to publish this story and they just sat on it for 3 weeks until they finally said, well, every other major news outlet in the world published this, so I guess we have to admit that it really happened. That's my speculation. I found it a very strange. I mean, when you're in the news business, you want to do things, you want to be accurate, right? But you also want to be fast, because if you're telling the story 3 weeks after everyone else, then who's going to care about your version of it? I found that very interesting. Another news story that I want to point to is, I'm sure this audience especially saw the hearings in Congress with the university presidents, who basically all refused to say that calling for genocide against the Jewish people, or just calling for attacks against the Jewish people, right? You could argue that intifada is just violence and not genocide, but violence is bad enough. They declined or refused to say that it violated their code of conduct again and again and again. And there was a headline in the New York Times, which I don't have the headline itself in front of me, but basically it was sort of like university presidents defend themselves against accusations from Republicans, I think it even said, of anti-Semitism. I was like, that's the headline? They're defending themselves against accusations of anti-Semitism? How about university presidents refuse to fight anti-Semitism on their campuses, or refuse to, acknowledge that calling for genocide is a bad thing? And I think that's one of these places where you talk about the biases of the reporters coming into play, that, because it was Elise Stefanik, who's a Republican, asking the questions, they just couldn't see that there was something wrong with the people answering the questions, as opposed to the politician asking them. It's a real problem. I think it's a problem. It's a political problem in the US, because there's, over the years, the Israel issue has become more and more of a partisan issue, even though for the most part, I mean, not 100%, but there is real bipartisan support for Israel in Congress. And we see it really now in this war and with the White House and everything. The biases and the way the stories are told are through this really partisan lens and this partisan angle, which is a problem. I mean, it's really twisting the way the story is told in a way that I think doesn't really reflect the truth. And so the Israel biases have sort of trickled down into biases and telling stories about anti-Semitism and about American Jews. So we're at the 30-minute mark, I think, and I actually managed to make my many points that I had said this was a broad topic. So I'm happy to answer questions, or if there's some other media story that I haven't mentioned that you want me to talk about.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, Lahav, thank you for that. There's a lot, obviously, to unpack and uncover, and you did a good job in a short amount of time. But obviously, there are many questions. Alex, you joining on camera? Are you joining us? Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Well, I'll ask the first question. I'll make a brief comment also. At a certain level, for those of us who are, shall we say, old, a lot of this isn't new. I think the first, I mean, I remember 1973. I don't remember the media coverage, but I do remember the media coverage of 1982 very, very well. And that was sort of set a certain standard for tendentiousness, and really the idea of narrative. The war is the narrative in a way that has maintained itself since then, and the question of access through stringers and also by simply being nice to evildoers, that's very familiar to us who were observing very closely the Gulf Wars, and where journalists would simply come out and say, yeah, we had to say nice things about Saddam Hussein because otherwise we would have gotten kicked out of the country. So there's a lot that's very familiar, but there is one very new element in this conflict in particular, and that's social media. And I want to see if you would talk a little bit about the platform formerly known as Twitter. I refuse to use the name X, and its role in cultivating they call citizen journalism, as a balance, as a corrective, as its own phenomenon, and also TikTok, which is a Chinese-owned propaganda platform, which with an algorithm that pushes propaganda at you. So,
yeah, I mean, first of all, social media was how we saw all of the terrible things that Hamas was doing, basically while they were doing it. And that's sort of bad enough, right? Theoretically, after ISIS was putting beheading videos on social media, they were supposed to be clamping down on these kinds of like really horrible things. But there are social media that are not run by Americans, that do not have, I mean, not that all Americans have the same values either, but that are Chinese owned or that are Russian owned, and they'll just let anything go, unless it's of course against themselves, but they'll let anything go if it's against Westerners or against Israelis. And so unfortunately we were seeing these horrific things happening in real time. I mean, unfortunately, in a sense though, it's good that people were able to actually bear witness and actually be able to see what really happened. That being said, it doesn't stop there from being all these deniers, right? There's all these people who think it's a false flag, that Israel did it themselves, that Israel ignored the warnings on purpose because they wanted to go in and ethnically cleanse Gaza. I mean, it's just like endless conspiracy theories. Unfortunately, there's a conspiracy theory even based on an article of mine, because one time Netanyahu was being criticized for allowing Qatar to give humanitarian aid to Gaza, and Netanyahu defended it in a few different ways. One of his defenses was, if you don't want a two-state solution, it's good to keep Hamas and the Palestinian Authority divided. And then people took that and twisted it and said, look, Netanyahu was funding Hamas because he doesn't want the Palestinians to have a state. So if you've seen that conspiracy theory on the internet, it is rooted in part in a misreading of an article I wrote 4 years ago. So all these conspiracy theories going on. And it's really terrible. You also see this crazy kind of, it's not new, but I think it's just becoming more widespread, this sort of what they call the horseshoe theory, where the extreme left and the extreme right kind of come together, except there's not even a horseshoe anymore. It's just like a circle. It's just completely closed the gap. You have these like white supremacists in the US who are spouting what you would normally consider like pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian ideas and propaganda. And these two sides are like feeding into each other, right? Where you have the pro-Hamas Islamist sort of world and the white supremacist world, who are using each other's tweets and using each other's ideas and materials. And it's a scary thing. You talked about the idea of like citizen journalism, right? And there's definitely certain positive sides to it that the traditional media has to kind of watch out, that they can't just, I mean, people still have their narratives, right? Journalists still have their preferred narratives, but like if there are other sides to the truth, that it's going to get out there. But unfortunately, it's not only the truth that's out there, it's the lies that are out there too. And with X, it seems to me that it's genuinely open, right? I mean, yes, is some content moderation. There are some things that are taken down, but it seems to me that their goal is to just be as open as possible, which, as we see, has its downsides, but it has its positive sides too. But with TikTok, I mean, we know there's endless evidence that they are using the most, you know, they're trying to push forward the most problematic and troublesome things when they have the ability to make it a sort of a clean, a positive, even an educational platform, because that's what TikTok looks like in China. And we see that the algorithm is pushing anti-Israel narratives and pushing anti-Semitism. There's all these studies been done and all these charts that graphs you can see online of how much more play those messages get than ones that are pro-Israel, than ones that are positive about Jews.
Alex, follow up before we go to the audience, or
I'll make one comment that I always make when Asaf and I do a webinar. That is, if you know, as a consumer and as an analyst, if you use only one news platform, you choose to be systematically lied to. If you reference a couple, you're getting a better picture, and if you read them all, you condemn yourself to insanity, but you might have a better idea of what's going on. And so, you know, read as much as you can from as many sources as possible. And that's the advantage of Twitter, frankly. So, but why don't we take some questions from the folks in the audience?
yeah, sure. We can come back also as well. So there are a bunch here. Let me see, you know, something, you know, so to your last point, Lahav, I mean, there is, you know, about the rape and the sexual violence and whatnot. There's been a lot of reporting about that, but Roger Gottlieb is asking, why do you think that there has been a downplaying of the sexual violence against women? And I would say, add to that more, you know, where is the outcry, you know, which is obviously getting to be reported of late from the women's organizations and the United Nations, and about the documentation. I mean, you know, this denial and this immediate acceptance of the Ministry of Health of Gaza, aka Hamas, without actually questioning anything that goes on, you know, coming out of that narrative. I mean,
so the sexual violence, part of the reason that it took time for those stories to surface is because of the sort of initial shock of the obvious violence of towns being burned down, of there being so many bodies to collect, and that were so hard to identify because of the level of violence against them. And once that so the first few days, right, these towns were like active combat zones. And also the area of the Nova Party, right? This whole area was an active combat zone, and it took about 3 days before Zaka, which is like the sort of main organization that was collecting the bodies, and could come in and start doing that. During that time, there were a couple of videos. Like I said, there were a few videos put on social media that indicated sexual violence against women. But once the body starting to be collected, then they could see much stronger evidence. And then, you know, took a few more days after that until people were speaking to media and saying what they saw. And again, it's people who are collecting the bodies and people who are working in the morgues. So you don't really have women who are testifying to these things having happened to them, women or men. And also people just underwent these deeply traumatic experiences. So now we know that there are people who witness these things. It's generally people at the party, at the rave, the Nova rave, who were basically lying down and playing dead, pretending to be dead so that they wouldn't also be killed, and started to tell the stories of what they told. So the fact that it took around a month for the stories to get out is just because there was so much else going on before. And also, I mean, there's this like criticism in Israel. Why didn't Israel do rape kits? Why didn't Israel take DNA samples off the bodies? And it was because rape kits can only be used in the first 48 hours after rape occurs. And in those first 48 hours, it was an active combat zone and the bodies weren't being collected yet. So the police was still trying to do what it can after that point once it saw this kind of evidence, but it's not so clear that there's going to be such strong DNA evidence. It'll be other things about the conditions that the bodies were found in and people who said they saw things. I only learned now, and again, this is weeks after I wrote my article, 2.5 weeks after I wrote my article, that there is actually a living victim of sexual violence, and she's in a mental hospital. So she's not someone who's going to talk to media. So it's just a really challenge. I mean, the initial people sort of didn't fully understand the story in the beginning, and it's still very, very challenging to report on. That being said, you know, I was in that briefing with the international media, and I heard some of the questions that some of the people were asking, that they were sort of, despite being shown testimony, despite being shown photographs of the way some of the bodies were found, and people in the morgue speaking about what they saw, there were people who asked questions as though they were deeply skeptical. I think it's fine to ask questions, you know, like even I asked questions where I tried to sort of nail down the details of some of the things they were telling us, and it's sort of horrible and gruesome, and you feel bad asking those questions, but you say you want to write something accurate. But some of the questions were being asked that you felt like they were like really, really skeptical at a level that I was just like, did you not just sit here for the past hour and see the things I saw? And those are the kinds of people where I like wonder where they're coming from, like what are their biases when they come in, you know? And it's sometimes reflected in the reporting. Ultimately, I think most of these stories, like really the BBC is like the only exception I saw in like mainstream media. I think most of these stories were ultimately reported in a sensitive and appropriate way. But it took a while. It did take a while. And in terms of the women's organizations, I mean, I just think that they've lost all credibility to speak for women and to claim that they are actually there to help all female victims of violence, and of sexual violence, especially. They have let other political views get in the way of their core mission. I think this is, you know, and I could talk for an hour about this. This is part of the problem of intersectionality, right? Where you have these sort of one grievance on top of another grievance on top of another grievance. And if you don't match all of these victimhood categories, then, you know, then you're the oppressor. And that's where I think it's coming from. And I think that it's just really heinous.
That's exactly what we've been seeing here in the academy, what we see all over the place as far as the gold standard of victimization, where no matter facts, you know, it is the anti-fact religion, as Alex and I like to talk about all around. You know, no matter how we present the facts, people refuse to believe them. Not to mention in the reactions that we've seen on campuses as far as the adulation and the exhilaration by individuals of support from us. So another question here that our Lisa Corson is asking, and this, you know, relates to your last point, you know, as far as, and again, you know, some of the points that you raised in your comments, is there any way to enforce any kind of journalistic standards as far as, you know, covering this issue? You know, even when you're presenting these facts, and, you know, is there something that can be held? Obviously, to Alex's point, it's harder to hold any standards when it comes to social media. But is there any, you know, in the guild of journalism, as far as reporting and whatnot, is there something that can be looked at from your perspective or used as a tool?
Theoretically, I mean, newspapers are supposed to be held to a certain standard. They have their own sort of standards and their own sort of guidebooks, and the like major newspapers in the US, you can find those standards online. And if you see that people are not working to their standards, you can write letters and you can ask for corrections, and those things happen. But usually the way it works with media is that the initial story gets the attention and the correction gets very little attention. And I think, you know, people, if you read stories about the media and about sort of the dramas that happen internally in newspapers, you can see that, like in the New York Times, for example, that for many years, the management seemed sort of afraid of the staff being like, quote unquote, woke, and the management sort of being afraid that they're not hip to the sort of new politics. They have gotten a little bit better in that respect. In the New York Times, I think, a lot of places there was sort of an overcorrection in 2020 with Black Lives Matter and everything like that. And a lot of institutions, not academia as much, but maybe other institutions are walking it back a little bit. And even the New York Times is walking it back a little bit. There are these organizations. I mentioned Honest Reporting tonight. There's another organization called Camera. They were founded during the Second Intifada because they felt that these news organizations were not keeping to their standards, to their ethical standards, and to they were not striving for objectivity as they should in their coverage of Israel. And they often call out these organizations. They follow these things very, very closely. And they do get corrections. But as I said, like, the articles get a lot more attention than the corrections ultimately.
Great, thank you. The evergreen question, that our friend Charles Feynman is asking, which is something, we spoke about in your earlier remarks, but, about the coverage of Israel. Obviously, it's done a better job, and we see Daniel Hagari doing this stuff, and we're seeing a lot of our friends, like from Peter Lerner to Jonathan Karikas and others, and talking in English and Arabic and whatnot. But still, obviously, the ongoing ingrained bias in the DNA. Is there something that you're seeing, given the I would say the more amplified narrative, and this goes back to Alex's point, since all of us have been kind of watching, the bias in the media for the past 20, 30 years, and how, even beyond that, how Israel has been covered in general. Is there a way to improve this, or this, no matter what we do, it's still a drop in the bucket, given the larger bias and the larger mediums that we're fighting? Or is there, is there anything that you, from your perspective, or that you're seeing now that can be used for improvement?
I can tell you that some of the top PR offices in Israel, people who usually work on political campaigns, people who usually work on high tech, they are doing their best. I am in a WhatsApp group that has like 800 people in it, almost all journalists, run by some of these public relations professionals, that in the first week of the war starting, they said, we're going to use our connections and our talents to try to get Israel's story out there. And they have done things like, when I was talking about the B-roll, right? When I was saying, like, I was talking about Israel and victims in Israel, and they would show like demolished buildings in Gaza, right? So they have created B-roll that people who, that Israelis or people who want to talk about Israel can offer news shows and say, please show this B-roll in the background instead of showing pictures from Gaza. They're sort of doing everything they can to like push out Israel's story as best they can. And some of these personal connections help. I mean, I think that they talk to producers and they say, when you call Hamas militants, that's biased language. They are actually terrorists. They do actually target civilians for political means, etc. All kinds of little things like that. And, in some ways, I think it does chip away at it. Ultimately, I do think that personal connections help. And I think that there are plenty of people who work in the media who are not biased against Israel, and they need to be sort of empowered. And people who do work in the media who are connected to those people need to keep trying to pitch them stories that they can use to keep telling Israel's story. And so you get journalists like Jake Tapper, who was an example I gave, who I think has been really, really on top of a lot of these stories, or Anderson Cooper also. It doesn't only have to be Jewish people, and also people who aren't big celebrities. I mean, like, I've spoken to people on Forbes and people on like New York One and WPIX. These are like the local New York news, but millions of people live in New York and watch those news channels as well. And you just need to it's like work that is not easy, because there's a bazillion different local news channels all over the US, and there's hundreds of people who work at all the different news stations, different producers on different shows and different hours. But that's really the way to do it. It's like sort of individual work.
Right. Let me ask you a question, and this is obviously something that's been a huge industry that we're all aware of, as far as the use of fake news. We saw it going back to the El Dura case and other kind of things that we've seen. And especially this was illustrated, when we went to the El Shifa hospital and, and the Run TC and whatnot, as far as the disconnect between the institutions and, so-called represent, the kind of value added and of course the reality itself. Talk about it a little bit about, how really fake news is impacted, as far as the disconnect between, myth and facts and reality in shaping all of this story.
I mean, fake news has been bad for the Jewish people going back to the Middle Ages, right? The original fake news is the blood libel. And unfortunately, it's like a model. It's like a pattern that you see over and over again, because you see how many times people want to talk about Israel is targeting children, which we all know is not true. And to me, I think that just goes back to sort of ancient anti-Semitic modes of speaking about Jews. So this fake news has been bad for Israel always. It's now I constantly see these conspiracy theories. There's these ideas that Israel, did October 7th to itself, or people said there's no hostages. The hostages are all fake news. And then Hamas started releasing the hostages. So then the new things they said was, oh, they were treated so well. Look how happy they look leaving. Look, they're saying shukran, thank you in Arabic as they leave, and they're waving goodbye as they leave. And it's like, you think like people can't possibly be that stupid. So they have to be doing it on purpose. They have to be just cruel, And then a few days ago, I was listening to a Knesset committee meeting, Knesset health committee meeting, that the Knesset members called in sort of the heads of some of the top people in the health industry to ask about how the freed hostages are being treated in the hospitals. And somebody mentioned that actually they were found to have been drugged when they left. So they were like a little loopy. And so then like someone waves to them and they're like, hey, they're high, and that was why some of these people looked the way they did, that they had these silly smiles and they were waving and being nice to the terrorists instead of acting like people who were scared, and it was very obvious to anyone who's really thinking about the situation that they weren't smiling and waving and saying goodbye because they loved these terrorists so much, right? But people just want to tell these crazy stories. There's this quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote this essay, Anti-Semite and Jew, which I recommend people read. He wrote it, I think in the early 1950s, but the quote says something along the lines of that the anti-Semite can be playful and can be as absurd as he wants because he doesn't have to use logic. It's the person, he puts the Jew on the defensive and the Jew is the one who has to use logic. He doesn't feel a need to be logical to make sense. And that's what you see over and over and over again on social media.
Great, thank you. There's a lot going with that. Alex, you had a question?
Yeah, I want to ask an unfair question. And it has to, it's a question about social class, and it has to do with journalists today. Those of us who were around in the 80s remember actual foreign correspondents who would assemble at the bar of the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem and drink heavily and exchange war stories about here and there in terrible places. But my perception today, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that journalism as a whole, and including foreign correspondents, is a bourgeois liberal arts vocation for upper middle class kids, and who are very much part of their social class, or very much a product of their social class, which is left wing to liberal to actually left wing, and who have to ascribe to particular narratives about Israel, about the world, and who as I think it was Ben Rhodes, former national security advisor, said they're all 25, they know nothing. And is that your experience? Is that your perception? Am I wrong?
I think there's a couple different things going on there. That's very much my impression. I mean, I have lived in Israel most of my life, and I think Israeli journalists are a little bit different in that way. But I sort of straddle that line between Israeli journalists, who I consider my personal milieu, but I often am going to things that are for the international journalists, and I mean, this isn't about class, but they seem so disconnected from like actual Israelis, even though they live in Israel. You know, like if they have kids, they send their kids to like the American school that the diplomats go to. You know, like they're not like involved in Israeli life and they don't know what's going on here. But in terms of the class issues, I mean, I know that Batya Unger Sargon, who's an editor at Newsweek, she's written a book about this, about how like it used to be a much more working class profession, and now it's a much more like elitist one, and that has really shifted the way the news is covered. And that certainly sounds right to me from the impressions I've gotten. But there was a second part to your question that I'm now blanking on. I wanted to say something else about what you said. What was the second part? What was the second point you made towards the end there?
I don't know. Somebody can fill me
All
in. Maybe
right.
I'll stop
When I
remembers,
if I hope
but
I remember what it is, this is going to bother me.
well, it has to do with ascribing to the narratives of your social class.
Social class.
Right.
Not your social class, that of,
No,
that
I
of
know.
journalists, bourgeois, upper middle class, liberal arts graduates who are derived from a liberal to left-wing background who cannot think outside of these frameworks.
Yeah, my feeling is like, now I know what they all talk to the same, like, and I, you know, when I'm talking about Israel, they all talk to the same experts in Israel too, right? They all talk to like the liberal to left experts in Israel on security, on politics. So you end up with the same, and the mainstream media of Israel, right? The most popular news channels, well, not the most popular newspaper, but the second most popular newspaper has the same sort of biases as the mainstream press in Israel, and they just like talk to those people. And so I could say, like, for me as somebody who is bringing what's happening in Israel to an international audience, I like try very hard to talk to people who aren't getting into those newspapers, and that my readers who probably also read the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, whatever, you know, I want to bring them people and voices that they may not have been hearing. So like I'm having an article coming out the next couple of days, writing about the hostages families forum, right? And these are the people who are advocating for the hostages to be freed. And they've sort of advocated very heavily for a deal that to release a lot more Palestinian terrorists in exchange for hostages. Now, this is like a really difficult dilemma that I don't know the answer to, right? Like but you don't hear so much the voices, and these voices exist, of families of hostages who say, we need to defeat Hamas and the IDF has to do its job. And that's the way we'll get them out. And that stopping the war and releasing more terrorists is just going to put more people in danger. You know, so while the bigger group really is that first group, which is the only group you ever hear about in the media in English, like I don't think anybody's ever written about the second group. I said, this second group exists, and you hear them in Hebrew too. My feeling is that most of the international, like the foreign journalists who are in Israel, they're not looking for those smaller voices. They're not looking for those alternative voices. They just, yeah, it's like this bubble that even the Israelis they talk to sort of share their backgrounds and their biases.
And this is very much how it works in Washington in particular. That the same people talk to the same people in an echo chamber, and various administrations, Republican and Democrat, use this as a way to amplify their messaging.
Right.
And it goes on in every Western society, but it takes advantage of the particular background of the journalists themselves. And Israeli journalists, at least in my experience, are somewhat more diverse crowd, socially, ethnically, class-wise, but British journalists absolutely are not, and American journalists not so much, really. It's you're hearing from the bicoastal elites, to coin a phrase, and those narratives get reified, amplified into particularly print media and broadcast media.
It's an ongoing issue. I didn't mean to cut you off, Alex.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was going to take look at combine two here from the audience. Again, related to the last point that Alex made, as far as the class and the echo chamber that you see here, I mean, is there, some of the comments that have come, from our audience this afternoon is like, why aren't reporters from the Washington Post, New York Times, asking the tough questions from Hamas leadership? Is that, and obviously in the old days, from my own experience, I mean, it would be like a certain kind of reporters that would be there and covering the same. It was the story. They already had the story between Ben Gurion to the border and kept on recycling that. Are you seeing, the same kind of narrative now, or the same people who are coming with the, kind of 3x5 cards already, printed out before they even have, and they already have the predetermined answer, or they're just afraid to ask the questions? I mean, to add to that.
So back in 2014, when there was Operation Protective Edge, and that was like the biggest operation in Gaza before this one, the journalists realized that if they asked overly difficult questions, and if they said things that Hamas didn't want them to say, then they just would lose access. And I actually had interviewed someone at the time who, when he was done in Gaza, came out and spoke under his own name and everything about the conditions, about how, yes, they were constantly seeing rockets being shot from the roofs of residential buildings, from the vicinity of hospitals, that it was like very clear that these things were going on right in front of them, and that they just couldn't say that while they were in Gaza because it put their lives in danger. That same person then went to report on ISIS, and he said that that in Iraq, or wherever he was exactly, that they found this article and it was putting him in danger. So ultimately the Jerusalem Post decided to erase it. So I can't even send you the link anymore, unfortunately. But back in 2014, I had written another article where I collected like various tweets and then like news reports that say were not in English, and so my English language readers might not have been aware of, also attesting to the fact that Hamas was shooting at residential areas, right? Since 2014, Gaza has been a lot more closed to journalists. And so the only journalists in Gaza are the ones who live in Gaza and then are hired as freelancers or stringers by the foreign press. And so you don't have as many of these Western people who are living there, looking around, seeing the conditions, and really openly and honestly being able to report on it, at least when they leave, right? Now the reporters in Gaza are Gazans, or they're embeds who are coming in with IDF soldiers. And I think their access to actual Hamas leadership is very limited. So some of the Hamas leadership, we know that the quote unquote political leadership is in Qatar. And so there is some access to them. Sometimes you see televised interviews and they'll like deny that, they'll like, they play this game where they like deny bad things happened on October 7th, but then they say also October 7th is just like a dress rehearsal. It's going to be even worse. We're going to do October 7th again and again. But I do find that when they say crazy things like that, that journalists do call them out on it, even if it's like left wing, BBC, Sky News, where the expectations are very low. And I also think it's really interesting that sometimes in Arabic media they get very tough questions because they're not particularly friends of Israel in Arabic media, but I think that they know that Hamas doesn't treat the people who live in Gaza very well. And so there's interesting things that you can find like on Memory or in Palestinian Media Watch about things like that.
Great. Unfortunately, Lahav, and I want to thank you. I mean, our time is up, so I want to make sure that everybody, stick to our time frame. But I hope you can. I really want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us. I hope you can come back, and obviously see us in person at some point as well in your travels to DC. But I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Alex, Lahav, for joining me. Be on alert for future webinars. I apologize we didn't get to everybody's questions this afternoon. We will look at them and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion after the webinar. And I hope everybody has a good day. And obviously continue to watch and to look for all sources of media, especially on this topic, to get the full picture. And of course, read Lahav stuff. It's good stuff, and it's important to read to know what's going on.
Thank you.
Take care.